So how do you even begin to understand a leader whose behavior seems to break all the rules all the time? Well, our source material suggests we have to become something like psychological archaeologists. We're going to dig through the layers of one of the most documented public figures in modern history. Let's get started.
Right off the bat, the source wants to make one thing crystal clear. This analysis isn't about taking sides, it's not about making excuses. The goal here is to understand the mechanics of a phenomenon so you can predict what it's going to do next. Think of it less like cheerleading and more like chess.
And here's the puzzle we're trying to solve. The Washington Post kept a running tally, and he came to over 30,000 false or misleading claims in just a 4-year span. I mean, just let that sink in. How do you make sense of that? Well, the source material says we have to dig, layer by layer, starting from the surface and going all the way back.
So, layer 1, the very top layer, is the public myth. You know it well. This is that carefully built image of the ultimate dealmaker, the master businessman, an image created largely by reality TV and a ghost-ridden book that, let's face it, became a huge part of pop culture. And this is where the source draws a really stark contrast. On one side, you have the myth, the tough, infallible CEO from The Apprentice. But on the other side, you've got the documented reality. We're talking multiple corporate bankruptcies, a huge inheritance, and significant government subsidies. It's a different picture. And wow, if you want something that really shows the gap between the persona and the person, look no further. This is a quote from Tony Schwartz. He's the guy who actually wrote The Art of the Deal. He helped create the myth, and he later said that book was his single greatest regret in life.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper, to the next layer down. The source argues that if you get past that shiny mythological surface, you start to find the architects, the key people who basically installed the software, the fundamental operating system for his behavior.
And it starts with his father, Fred Trump. The lesson, drilled into him over and over again, was simple and it was brutal. The world is a tough, competitive jungle, and the only way to make it is to be a killer. In that worldview, anything short of absolute, total domination was just weakness.
So you take that raw aggression his father taught him, and then you send him to the New York Military Academy. According to the source, this is where that aggression got refined. It got honed into an actual methodology for control. Leadership through force and through ridicule. The very same behavior that got him kicked out of his old school was suddenly a huge asset in this much tougher world.
But the final and maybe the most important mentor, according to this analysis, was the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn. Cohn's philosophy was basically a masterclass in how to wage war in public life. You attack relentlessly, you counterattack instantly, and you never, ever, ever say you're sorry.
And this is the playbook Cohn gave him, broken down into 3 simple steps. The source argues this became the blueprint for every single fight, from real estate battles in New York all the way to the White House. And the key thing to get here is that whether an accusation is true or not is completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the fight.
All right, now we get to the very center of our dig. The source makes a powerful claim here, that this entire system, the myth-making, the aggression, that Roy Cohn playbook, it's all a massive structure built on top of a foundation of deep, unresolved childhood trauma. The analysis points to these specific moments. At just 2.5 years old, his mother basically vanished from his life for almost a year because of a life-threatening medical emergency. Then, at 13, his own father sends him away. And later, as a young man, he had a front-row seat to his father's cruelty, completely breaking his older brother Freddie. Now, to put a number on this, analysts have used a framework called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. They estimate his score is a 6. Now, you need to understand a score of just 4 or more is statistically linked to some really severe negative outcomes in adults. A score of 6 or more predicts an average life expectancy that is 20 years shorter. It's a staggering number. So what does this do to a person psychologically? Well, according to the source, you can understand it through what's called attachment theory. All these events likely created a dismissive, avoidant style. That's when a kid learns, hey, my emotional needs are not going to be met. So they adapt. They learn to push down their feelings, avoid real closeness, and build this kind of fortress of extreme self-reliance. And you know, he's basically said as much himself. He says this as if it's a good thing, a boast about how consistent he is. But the source interprets it completely differently, as a confession. The emotional toolkit of a first grader, built to survive an incredibly tough childhood, is still the main operating system for the adult.
So let's bring all these layers together now.
The core argument from the source is that these wounds from his childhood didn't just disappear, they were transformed. They were turned into a predictable set of psychological weapons, behavioral patterns that we can actually use to predict his future actions.
The source draws these really clear, direct lines from the wound to the weapon. The absence of his mother, it leads to a deep inability to trust anyone, making all relationships purely transactional. The cruelty from his father, it teaches him that aggression is the only tool that works, that you have to dominate. And watching what happened to his brother, it creates this profound contempt for anything that looks like weakness.
And these patterns become almost like computer algorithms that you can use for prediction. Every single interaction has to be a win/lose battle. Any perceived insult, no matter how small, triggers an overwhelming counterattack. Loyalty is a one-way street. He demands it, but doesn't have to give it. And truth? Well, truth isn't fixed. It's just another tool you can bend to fit the story you need to tell.
And that brings us right back to where we started, to the main point of this whole analysis. The purpose of this psychological archaeology, according to the source, isn't to excuse any of the behavior. It's to understand the underlying patterns so deeply that you can actually predict what's going to happen next.
And so, this leaves us with the final big question that the source poses. The patterns are clear, they're consistent, the psychological programming is rigid. So what happens? What happens when a mind that was built from the ground up to deny every single limit finally runs up against a limit that it cannot talk its way out of and cannot fight its way past?